So good afternoon and welcome to the first session of the 2021 ACSP Administrators Conference. It is so good to see you all, and I know many of you, but I'm Renya Ehrenfeucht and I am the chair of the ACSP Committee on the Academy. And I am really excited to be, part of this workshop. This was co-organized with the Faculty Women's Interest Group, and Betsy Sweet, who is the president of FWIG, will be facilitating. And just as we get started, I want to give you a quick outline of today and tomorrow. Following this session, there will be a plenary panel with deans discussing leadership at the convergence of crises. Between the sessions and after the plenary panel, we do have informal conversation space using Remo, and thank you to Ann Forsyth, who just appeared actually in my line of vision for that, and that information is in the schedule that Donna sent. So please come and chat, and it gives an opportunity to sit at tables and talk in small groups and kind of seek out people just to say hi. So tomorrow morning, we will hear from our ACSP leadership, Marlon Bornett and Lakshmi Ramasubramanian. And I know they're both here now, and you're welcome to say hello now too if you want. But they will also both be giving comments tomorrow morning. Then we have two great sessions tomorrow too, globalizing the planning curriculum and fostering belonging in planning departments. And so I look forward to seeing you there. But now I'll turn to the focus of this session, the spaces and places of discrimination and how to end it. And this is really important for us in university administration, for those of us who are chairs and program administrators. And yet we rarely think of eliminating discrimination and harassment as a role that we have as administrators. In fact, Betsy and I were talking last week, and she mentioned the role of reducing harm. And in that moment, I realized I never thought of that as an explicit role that I had, even as I'm trying to do it, even as I see the need for it. And it just really affirmed to me how important it is to have this session. And I thank you all for being here today and for your commitment to doing this work. We're beginning this session with a conversation with two people who are actively working in this area. Elizabeth Hutchison, the Associate Vice President for Equity Inclusion at the University of New Mexico, and Jeff Kenny, he joins us from Oregon State University, where he serves as the Director of Institutional Education for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. Unfortunately, Reverend Dr. Charles Howard at the last moment had a situation, so he is not going to be able to join us. The workshop will continue with a guided self-reflection and discussion. And I will say that I know for many of us, this is not intuitive or comfortable, but it's really critical because it's critical to how we understand, how we respond. It shapes how we see, how we hear, what we see, what we hear, and it ends up shaping how we act. After that, we'll take a short break, and then in breakouts, develop actionable strategies for our departments and programs. The Committee on the Academy will collect and compile the strategies, and we're planning on sharing them after the conference, like the collection of them. And we'll also be asking everyone to identify what resources they might need, and this can also shape future workshops or trainings and other things that we can do to really work, as we work collaboratively on this. So I am now going to turn it over to our panelists, and they are both going to tell you a little bit more about their background and experiences and share their perspectives. We then have some questions to pose, but we also welcome your questions. So please put them in the chat, and I'll monitor the chat and then be posing questions after they both give their comments. So now, just again, I know you do all have access to the bios and they're on the conference website, but Elizabeth Hutchison, who is the Associate Vice President for Equity and Inclusion at the University of New Mexico, is a Latin American historian specializing in 20th century Chilean women's labor history and a scholar activist of human rights movements. She has served extensively in faculty governance, and in 2016 co-founded Faculty for a Sexual Assault-Free Environment at the University of New Mexico. which we call Faculty Safe, an organization that channels faculty involvement to promote policy change, strengthen support and advocacy, and advance research on campus sexual assault at UNM. And Jeff Kenny serves as the Director of Institutional Education for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, as I said, at Oregon State University. And he first joined OSU in May 2012, and he has served in many different important roles, including as a coordinator for the LGBTQ plus outreach and services, Associate Director for Research and Assessment, and Associate Director for Community Dialogue and Engagement in the Department of Diversity and Engagement. Jeff, would you like to get started as Liz rejoins?
Yeah, sure, I'd be happy to. So thank you again for having me. I spend most of my waking hours at Oregon State University trying to conceptualize the learning needs of a wide swatch of constituents. So my emphasis is faculty and staff development. And when I think about lifelong, career-long learning for diversity, equity, and inclusion, I hold both the unique responsibilities of tenured research faculty alongside those of academic advisors and people who run residence halls and custodial staff and groundskeepers. And there's a lot that these different constituents have in common, and their specific roles in their sphere of influence require different skills, knowledge, and attitudes to help us realize our mission for diversity, equity, and inclusion. And a substantial function of my role is to provide not only development for faculty and staff, but executive level leadership. And my colleagues and I have spent several years now developing a curriculum that we think is particularly germane to folks who have a demonstrable sphere of influence as it relates to recruitment selection, as it relates to budgets, faculty and staff governance. And so we provide comprehensive trainings in cohort models to department chairs, vice presidents, vice provosts, directors of research centers, and various other functions. And we emphasize on that group a very particular curriculum because they have a special role and unique opportunities in helping us shift the trajectory of our institution. And so to introduce myself and introduce my work, I'm going to talk a little bit about the types of learning that I think are essential of folks who are in positions much like yours. People who are responsible for the leadership of a department, perhaps of a school or a college within a larger university. And these learning outcomes have implications for folk at the highest echelons of the institution as well. But to say it succinctly, I think the type of career-long learning I expect for people in academic leadership include the various competencies related to leading organizational change, to build coalitions for folks across polarized social groups, the ability to facilitate organizational learning at a lot of levels, and then to respond with care to communities who are experiencing conflict and crisis. And so I'll name a little bit about what each of those things include and what we do at Oregon State, like where we prioritize at Oregon State University to prepare faculty leaders to help us advance our mission for DEI. So when I think about leading organizational change towards achievement of diversity, equity, and inclusion, first we help folks conceptualize urgent inequities from an ecological perspective. So to see how inequity exists at the local level, within the community itself, within our region of our state and institution, and on a larger global and structural level. And so leading change for diversity, equity, inclusion requires understanding the relationship of the interpersonal dynamics of your department into the largest scope of the global economics of our current status quo and everything in between. We also think it's important that leaders theorize institutional change from scientific, cultural, psychosocial, and critical perspectives. And we know faculty have a bent for theory in general, and we try not to stay wholly in a theoretical place, but sometimes faculty and faculty leaders need a larger portfolio of theories in their tool belt to lead this type of work effectively. And lastly, we make we take time to specifically emphasize how white supremacy and neoliberal pressures apply on and within the academy and inhibit our ability to advance diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we try to equip our leaders with the critical literacy to recognize the influences of white supremacy and neoliberal capitalism in the functionings of our university. Another area of emphasis is building coalitions so that we can develop and advance strategic priorities. So we help leaders wield frameworks and tools for adaptive strategic planning, a tradition that comes out of ecosystem restoration and more generally resource management. We try to equip with the skills necessary to cultivate cooperation among polarized constituents and to move through the work of coalition building in ways that are humble, vulnerable, and responsive and nimble in shifting to the unique and ever-changing demands of various constituencies. Another place of emphasis of our work is facilitating organizational learning. So leaders taking responsibility not just for their own learning, but the learning of other individuals, of other teams, and creating cultures of learning that continue to advance our goals. So what this means is that we spend some time helping them conceptualize cultural competence across the lifespan and across disciplinary context. What does it mean to spend the rest of your career growing knowledge, skills, and attitudes for diversity, equity, and inclusion? And that they could then pair that understanding of career-long learning with the challenges of critical pedagogy and learning design for diversity, equity, and inclusion. So taking the baseline knowledge many of our leaders have of designing learning experiences in their own classrooms and imagining their department, their college, their school as a larger learning environment and how to stimulate career-long learning within it. And then this also includes heavy investment in the skills necessary to facilitate intergroup dialogue and manage cognitive dissonance and conflict. We compel our leaders to initiate the spaces where really difficult conversations are going to happen and emotions will get riled. And so we provide some very concrete facilitation strategies so leaders can hold their peers and the people within their organizations in that dissonance. And lastly, to kind of close out the area of emphasis is responding with care to communities in conflict and crisis. We see leaders very often make a bad situation worse in the ways that they show up to care by people who have been harmed by racism and classism and sexism and heteronormativity. And so this includes a lot of skill sets. One is preparing them to model and cultivate both bystander and institutional bias intervention, that they understand for themselves the negative impacts of implicit bias that happen at the interpersonal level, and with their ability to recognize modeling for their peers, what that can look like, but also recognizing how bias is embedded in larger institutional systems like recruitment and selection and promotion and tenure. Responding to care to communities in crisis also looks like learning to balance advocacy and empowerment. That sometimes the ways that we best care for people doesn't necessarily mean always doing things on their behalf, but instead empowering people who have been adversely impacted to lead change in their own lives and providing them the resources to do that. But striking the right balance so that folk don't feel either paternalized with a heavy emphasis on advocacy or alienated by pushing so hard into a dimension of empowerment. And then lastly, the ways universities and leaders respond to communities in crisis tends to be ripe for cultures of white supremacy and neoliberal logics. So branding, efficiency, emphasis on money, those are all things that can complicate doing really important care work as people navigate the adverse impacts of racism and classism and sexism. And so helping leaders conceptualize how those forces influence their care response and getting some strategies to mitigate that. So that's what I'll do with my 10 minutes, to introduce myself and to introduce my work, is how I conceptualize the learning priorities of folk who have careers much like yours. But if my colleague was able to rejoin us on the panel, I would love to.
Hi, everybody. I am talking to you from my phone since UNM's infrastructure has mandated that this is the perfect time to update all the systems on my computer. Jeff, thank you. If you're done, I'll go ahead. Would that be okay? All right. Well, better another Zoom without a presentation set of slides. So I will go ahead and apologize for the technical difficulties and share the slide deck with everyone later. I would like to focus on a story about institutional courage, which is a framework given to us by Jennifer Fried, a psychologist at the University of Oregon, who has gone on to found the Center for Institutional Courage as a locus of activity of research and best practice sharing nationally about intervening in sexual harassment and assault in higher education in particular. And the way I get from being a Latin American historian to someone talking to you about institutional courage is actually precisely located in the arrival of the 34-page single-spaced Department of Justice report in April of 2016, which mandated a 3-year surveillance of UNM for its failure to appropriately address sexual assault and sexual harassment and uphold Title IX on our campus. In that period, what became painfully evident early on was that the nature of Title IX and its focus on compliance was bringing about important changes in areas of investigation of assault, training in sexual assault awareness for students, staff, and faculty, as well as improved bandwidth in investigations and resolution of complaints. All of those things were moved forward incredibly fast, quickly in response to the Department of Justice findings in 2016 and successfully concluded in 2019. But early on in this, it became pretty painfully obvious that a compliance focus was, on the one hand, overlooking some significant areas of research into the treatment of trauma, of the nature of higher education and its strategies and embedded cultures that are highly hierarchical. And in other ways, we're marginalizing faculty and faculty expertise from the prospect of addressing Title IX compliance and sexual assault and harassment more broadly. So in that context, I think Renia introduced the organization that a group of faculty founded by mid-2016, Faculty for a Sexual Assault-Free Environment at UNM. And this was a group of about 80 faculty who were concerned that, in particular, the president's response to the Department of Justice had dismissed the concerns that had been investigated, and particularly the voices of victims who had come forward and spoken to the Department of Justice about the deficiencies of UNM's response. So we began organizing and in brief engaged in collaborative work on sexual harassment policies, started a couple of important research studies on our campus, specifically studies of campus climate and of trainings, and in other ways tried to show the face of faculty as participants in the systems that were being tightened and addressed in this Title IX compliance context. From that work, I became involved with an effort that was launched in 2018, 2019, that I'd love for everybody to have access to when my PowerPoint slide eventually gives it to you. And that is, in 2018, some of you may already know, the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine, or NASEM, published a profoundly important research report on sexual harassment in higher education. And from that report and its recommendations, the NASEM founded an action collaborative for preventing sexual harassment in higher education, that involved 60 member institutions, universities, colleges, research units, health science centers across the country, and built a 4-year plan for continuing with new research, sharing out and developing best practices in institutional change, and in other ways surfacing what we call the sort of profound, the deep problems of sexual harassment that pervade the campus climate. And so what I'd like to draw your attention to is how the NASEM study and its the Action Collaborative that's grown from it positioned our gaze in a fundamentally different place from Title IX, which, as you know, has been very troubled, has recently gone through a major transformation because of the Department of Education's new law on Title IX. And yet, what we notice in Action Collaborative work is the need to move beyond addressing harms to students to addressing the broader context of staff and faculty entitlements under Title IX. And then beyond that, to try always to center survivors and also center research in designing appropriate interventions. And I think a number of the interventions Jeff was talking about with respect to bystander intervention, campus climate, implicit bias training, these are all in the category of best practices. They are not, unfortunately, the ones that the Department of Justice or the Department of Education always insists that we pursue. And so it's in that area of these different perspectives: one, compliance, institutional responsibility, risk aversion, and on the other, a more integrated approach to how sexual harassment occurs, how it intersects with racial and disability and sexuality bias. Trying to bring these two perspectives together on my campus has become my portfolio in the Division for Equity and Inclusion. I'll just say a couple of things about what we're developing to fundamentally shift the paradigm from compliance to a user-centered approach, because I think these might give you some ideas about what can be enacted at the college and department level within your own sphere of influence. First, given that, especially after the DOJ, we have a lot of resources available on our campus, not enough, but more than many campuses. We have designed or are beginning to implement what we call a Wayfinder website for staff and faculty to give them private and independent access to information about policies, procedures, support services, confidential and non-confidential places they can go, formal and informal processes, in order to center users and give them the greatest, remove barriers to them accessing the services and processes that they wish to pursue. Secondly, we're enacting a high-level commission to push forward what in the conflict management literature is an integrated conflict management system, which means a way of pulling together a comprehensive evaluation of the services and responses that UNM provides, and where stakeholders find those services lacking, and how to improve communication and collaboration from advocacy to investigation, from the DEI space to academic affairs, and to sort of encompass the leadership across the campus and engage them in a common project to support targets of discrimination and harassment. Finally, because much of the work of the Action Collaborative, particularly in stimulating new research, has focused intentionally and explicitly on centering the experience of BIPOC, persons with disabilities, and sexual minorities who experience multiple and often intersecting harms and find systems often inadequate to addressing those harms together. We're going to sponsor here at UNM a lecture series aimed primarily at staff and faculty on the intersectionality of harms. And taken together, I think all of these efforts are really a starting point for what we hope will be a paradigm shift that takes us beyond compliance and allows us to interact with staff and faculty at UNM in a meaningful way. So once I recover my PowerPoint slides, I will share those out with all the resources, and I think I'll stop there and let us move to whatever you all want next.
Well, one question that Lakshmi just put in the chat correlates to a question that we had also thought of, which was thinking about this question of bystander intervention. And I'll say what she wrote: bystander intervention within an academic setting, such as a faculty meeting, or a closed meeting about tenure and promotion. And certainly some voices are shut down in those situations. And just if you could speak more about how to think about that, or what to do with that. I will say there's a second piece to this that I would also, and perhaps this is a second question, and that this happens in other ways as well. As certainly we know with academics and academic work, there is, we learn from other people, but sometimes that includes appropriating people's work or ideas and not fully giving credit for them. In some ways we may say that's formalized in some mentoring relationships. And certainly this real sense that, that sometimes mentors feel like they are doing let's say their doctoral students good by co-publishing, even though it does mean that they're taking credit for their work, but also something that happens a lot in meetings, like somebody has a good idea, but it only heard when it comes out of somebody else's mouth. And then again, that person, the original speaker, doesn't get credit for it. And so maybe two ways of trying to think of what would be interventions in those two areas. And perhaps, well, for both of you, if you could, anything you'd like to say.
I'm not really seeing the screen, so just tell me when I'm on.
Well, why don't you go ahead, and then we'll turn.
Thanks. That's a great question, and it goes right to the granular, right, of how do we prepare faculty, how do we prepare ourselves, our colleagues, and create an environment in which bystander intervention is both welcomed and protected. And frankly, I think in most contexts, we're a long way from feeling protected in speaking out in our departments. And I think that my recommendation it would be to think about the kinds of bystander trainings that would be effective with faculty. And a real critical part of any bystander intervention training has to do with practicing those responses and practicing interventions. So there are a number of great theater-based projects underway. University of Vermont has one. I know there are a couple of others that, rather than your sit and stand and deliver so that someone receives the benefit of a training, they're interactive, and they involve creating scenarios in which participants actively engage as players in taking roles, and others observe, to try to talk about the kinds of dangers or vulnerabilities that are activated in a situation where the kind of silencing or appropriation you're talking about is occurring, and what is the appropriate response? Is active intervention safe and appropriate? Is it safe for the person for whom you're intervening? Is it safe for you? And I can certainly send links to that program. We had them at UNM from University of Vermont, I think 2 years ago, and Advance at UNM sponsored 2 sessions of those workshops. And they really were terrific because they went right into, one of the scenarios was at the faculty mailboxes, another one was the faculty meeting. They're really thinking about the situations and the power differentials that are present in our spaces of work, because they're never absent. So I'd be happy to provide those links if that's of interest.
Yes, thank you. And Jeff?
Yeah, thanks for kicking us off, Liz. And what I'll just make reference to is a bunch of attachments that I just dropped in the chat box for y'all. So apologies if you're feeling smothered by input from my end. But what I wanted to share with you is several artifacts from the core curriculum of bias intervention training we provide at Oregon State University. What you'll find in those attachments include our overarching framework of what we think good bias intervention looks like. But our framework is not a protocol. Our framework is a point of reflection and dialogue for people to prepare for things that are wildly inconsistent and unanticipated. And so what we need for people to engage in effective bias response is a willingness to reflect, consult, dialogue, care, and use their critical thought. And what faculty and staff typically ask of us is the right, clear, and easy answers. And part of my role as a trainer is to let them down gently and allow them to grieve their expectations as I let them know that it's always going to be hard and it's always going to be messy. But here is the wealth of resources that we have for you in this messiness. So one of the links that I shared with you is a really important aspect of our bias intervention training, which is our bias response team and our bias response protocol, a collaboration of academic and student affairs led by our Office of Institutional Diversity that results in anyone having a question or a concern or an inquiry about bias they observed, or even trying to figure out if what they experienced or saw was bias. There's always somebody that they can consult with outside of their department and outside of their network to explore that. And I think that is the center of success of our training. We don't train people and then leave them on their own to their own devices. There's always centralized support for people to navigate these really difficult circumstances. Other artifacts that I dropped in there for you include a bias incident reflection worksheet that I give to lots of faculty that ask them two questions. We've created these composites of types of bias incidents that happen frequently at a place like Oregon State University, de-identified, and we ask them, what is your response? What is your sense of responsibility to intervene in this moment? And if you feel compelled to intervene, what is your capacity to do so? And we expect different answers for different people. And what we implore in the training is that your social and political location is a significant factor in you determining whether or not you're going to intervene bias. My identity and my location as a white man compels me to intervene in biases in ways that are different from my colleagues who identify as Black women. That there might be some situations where the best choice for my colleagues is to not intervene, to protect themselves and ensure their own safety, ensure their own care. And there are other situations where it is appropriate for them. But we don't have a consistent expectation that disregards the unique experiences of our faculty and our staff. We also frame much of our trainings as a reflection because the work we do around bias, in most cases, does not overlap with issues of compliance. And so most of the bias incidents that occur are fully within the realm of the law. Folk are completely entitled to them within their free speech rights. And many of our faculty and staff, that's where they're most comfortable. They're like, I am willing to engage in this work if I know without a doubt that what people are doing is against policy and against the law. And the reality is most of it isn't, right? And so we have to have people thinking about morality and responsibility that isn't confined to the really, really low bar of what's legal and what's within policy, right? That our values for diversity, equity, and inclusion are much more ambitious than the law and much more ambitious. But folk need to figure out, well, what do I say to confront somebody if I'm not holding themselves accountable to something bigger than me, right? And the reality is holding people accountable to our community values means you confront with the relationship, right? It's this is what I expect of you. This is how you've impacted me. I want to make you aware of your impact on the community. Is that who you want to be, right? And those are much messier places to be than to say, knock that shit off, right? And we try to create the trainings that allow people to prepare for those highly relational explorations. And that's certainly not always the case. And much of bias in some instances overlaps in issues of compliance. All the time in a place like Office of Institutional Diversity, we receive complaints of bias where it's our job to say, hey, this thing you've experienced is not only painful, but has violated your state and federal rights, right? Mm-hmm. And so we are going to now cooperate with other stakeholders in the institution to provide you the policy care that you deserve in addition to the community care. And the last artifact that I'll mention is a bigger picture framework of balancing advocacy and empowerment and reminding people all the ways care can manifest. Because one of the ways we intervene bias is acknowledging to people that we saw that it took place and being with them as they figure out what they want to do, in addition to these things that we can do to advocate on their behalf. And I believe there's a question, I think maybe from Divya, about how these types of trainings are received. By and large, bias intervention training is the most in-demand curriculum we have at Oregon State University. And one of the reasons for that is because it represents the majority of faculty and staff's sphere of influence, right? Bystander intervention is something they can do. And while we are happy to invest in our community in that way, we also recognize that there are structures that fertilize and exacerbate conditions of bias. And so bystander intervention alone is incomplete in creating fundamental change in organizational culture. It's a really important investment, but there's a lot of work that has to be done on the structural level to ultimately stop things coming downriver that result in bias in everyday life. But I'll pause there because I feel myself rambling.
Well, there is another question that speaks to this question of compliance, of how universities want to respond. And this sounds really fundamental to what both of your work and how you're thinking about this, is that certainly a compliance framework doesn't work. I mean, it's not working for numerous reasons, not the least of which is that, too many of the things people are experiencing are completely legal and outside the realm of what universities consider they need to intervene in. But even that intervention itself, as Liz was talking about, can be really harmful to the people who are already harmed by harassment, by discrimination. And I wonder if we can just, in a sense, spend more. Rolf asks, how do we help university administration push past this? But if you could both reflect on some of that, thinking about what we do in departments and how we can use that as a platform for expecting institutional change or working towards institutional change.
I need to think a little bit. Jeff, have you got some ready suggestions here?
No, but that's not going to stop me from talking.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah. So for those of you that identify as being in processes of leadership, all the time you are called to lead change that isn't within the realm of policy. I tend to think of compliance as issues of management, right? Here's this thing that we will definitively hold ourselves accountable to. And I just need to make sure people understand what the policy is, what the expectations are, and what are the consequences if they don't comply. And being a successful leader of an academic organization is not, by and large, issues of management, right? It's time consuming, it's complicated, right? I'm sure your email reflects a lot of management duties, and leadership is often about cultivating communities and organizations that are far more aspirational than compliance. And so think about ways that you have tried to lead changes in teaching within your departments. faculty relationships with students, interdisciplinary research, cooperation within the institution, different approaches to service. And I think while those things might be challenging and intimidating, maybe for some of you feel something qualitatively different about leading this work. And I think that's an important place of individual self-reflection. What is it about this very politicized, social, very tense socio-political dimension of leadership that leaves us feeling ambivalent, defaulting to compliance, defaulting to policy, maybe not being as bold and as ambitious as we would in some of these other places, like leading change with research and pedagogy and curriculum and things like that. But I'll pause there if Liz wants to jump in.
Yeah, no, I completely agree, Jeff. I think part of my concern about the ways that Title IX, and to a different degree, other compliance bars like Title VII, the way they inhibit leadership, because in part it brings immediately the question of institutional compliance and personal liability into the picture very often. That really restricts what people are able to do because they're getting a kind of legal advice that is risk averse. And like Jeff, I think that in fact, a lot of us who come into some faculty administrative leadership are bringing the values of our fields, of our professional communities, of our of our faculty status forward, and then we run into this wall of compliance. And folks' lack of familiarity, in particular with Title IX and what it does and does not require, or does now after August of last year, is another sort of limitation on, I think, the effectiveness of how people can lead in that situation. So I think my answer is complementary to Jeff's insofar as I think that those of us working in this area have to advance not so much trainings as education in this area, drawing where possible on local expertise to bring forward findings on violence and gender violence and racial bias from the expertise on our campus, and facilitate dialogue around precisely those norms and aspirations that are not contingent on a compliance framework, but rather are part of building a strong academic community. So I think there are trainings and there are trainings. It sounds like Jeff's office is offering a range of interactions that are accessible and available locally to people on our campus. I think we're still in a position of bringing in outside expertise and elevating some of the expertise we have on our campus, which is in the depth we have, for example, in the advocacy sector that's linked to our Women's Resource Center. And so, that's a long range project for a culture shift. But I agree, I think thinking about those different bars and how moving beyond compliance is actually consistent with the mission and values of our institutions and our professions is a way of delinking all of this, these harms from a formal process framework, right? And working outside of those complaints, not just those complaints that would move forward successfully within an equal opportunity office or a compliance framework, but really looking at all the informal and other resources there are available or can be created on a campus to help resolve conflicts and remediate harm. I mean, that is part of this process.
And can I ask a follow-up question? And this is really a question of just any thoughts on strategies. In planning, we do have the discipline, and our associated profession does have a code of ethics that, that speaks to social equity and justice. And yet we definitely experience this differently. And I think there is the question that we love the idea that all our colleagues are on board for doing this work, but that's not the experience and the reality. And oftentimes it's some of our colleagues who want to be and feel like they are, but when, if we start a conversation with perhaps something that came up at a faculty meeting or something that occurred in a different situation, that there isn't the same openness or reflectiveness around the harm that caused or the effect that has. And would be very interested in hearing both of your thoughts on the strategies to address that, or to have that conversation or move that forward.
Yeah, I'm happy to reflect a bit on that. So my current role, I do faculty and staff development around DEI work. My career trajectory leading me here is as a facilitator of interracial dialogue, and also as a clinical mental health counselor, someone who practices psychotherapy. And when I think about my work as a counselor, and I still moonlight one day a week at our counseling and psychological services on campus, a lot of individual care can be explained around issues of congruence. So this is your self-concept. This is who you think you are, what you say you value, and how you want to move through the world. And this is how you're actually behaving. And how close are those things together? And how can I be a partner with you in reflecting the dissonance or the inconsistencies of your self-concept? And I think that translates into a larger institutional level, which is a mission statement, a value statement, is a declaration of who we say we are or want to be. But there needs to be this important moment and relationship space for people to say, I see these incongruences with how you understand yourself, with how other people experience you, and how I experience you. And those moments are very vulnerable. They're grounded in conflict. And on the individual level, it requires an artfulness to hold people with care while they receive that kind of dissonant feedback. And interracial dialogue is about bringing together, white folk and Black folk and Indigenous folk and folk from other racially marginalized groups, and opening up a pathway of communication that complicates their worldview and complicates how they see themselves and how they see one another. And again, those spaces need to be held with care and require permission to be both vulnerable, engage in conflict, in hopes of strengthening the relationship. So both those examples that are coming to me, the foundation is creating strong relationships that can withstand conflict so that you can achieve congruence. And so where I see organizations struggle is I want to declare who I am, and any kind of congruence, I hope, happens in clean, private, discreet, and minimally conflict-inducing ways. And I don't think we can have that. So I think dialogue as an investment in community, as a function of education, is essential in and of itself. It is incomplete. But I think for organizations that are espousing these values, they need to make the heavy investment in resources and time to create these messy spaces for dialogue where folk can wrestle with their incongruence.
I really endorse that, Jeff, and I would like to have you on my campus to go and talk to about my conflicts. No, I think there is a when you speak about resources and a real commitment to connect lofty mission statements about diversity and inclusion with the experience of students and employees, it is a real slog. And where the resources are needed are in places that we know ultimately help resolve conflict at a lower level, right? And help, as you said, stop that sort of downstreaming of accumulated conflicts that erupt in real crisis. And honestly, the work that I've been doing shows, you know, confidential advocacy, ombuds services, you know, conflict management, training and intervention. These are all typically under-resourced in comparison to the scale of the problem. But if you look at the professional sectors that provide these kinds of services, I think their outcomes demonstrate that they can produce these informal mechanisms along with a strong and transparent process for formally resolving complaints, like that they go together, that these reduce the level of conflict and increase satisfaction, decrease departures or changes at the staff level in avoidance of misconduct. And so I think as leaders, our obligation in part is to keep making that argument for those investments. Just because the Department of Justice is not in Albuquerque this year does not mean that the Title IX issue and everyone's equal access to employment and education has been resolved. And fortunately, we have some campus leadership that is really devoted to finding those resources and moving us forward. So.
And so we are down to a few more minutes, but we do have 2 more questions in the chat that if you both have a few thoughts to reflect on. And one is from Clara about COVID, asking, does anyone have experience or insights or having started conversations about how to address the differential impact that COVID has had on faculty productivity in annual reports, tenure and promotion processes without accentuating prevalent biases such as women and people of color are less competent when they, are, kind of facing, well, when people are facing very different financial and familial stress.
Right. I would say just briefly, the way this has come about at UNM has been really, the lead has been taken by Advance at UNM, an NSF funded project housed in academic affairs, which started to build this conversation from a campus-wide survey of faculty and work-life balance under COVID, and I think was instrumental in securing some administrative accommodation for extending timelines and really making visible the different gendered and racialized impacts of COVID on faculty productivity and teaching, well-being, mental health, et cetera. Those are all sort of part of what we were able to document on the campus, was already underway, and secure some, particularly for junior faculty, some accommodations. But I think we've barely seen the tip of that iceberg, really, because this pandemic is going to have a long tail, obviously, with respect to impacts on faculty and on our academic prospects.
Thanks for kicking off that reflection, Liz. 2 perspectives that I think are important and challenging for academic leaders in the COVID moment is that it exacerbates tensions between competing values of equity and equality. The best way to be fair is giving everyone the same thing, versus the best way to be fair is giving everyone what they need to succeed. And an equality mindset in COVID exacerbates the tensions of race, class, gender, and so on and so forth. And but this is an important moment for that concept to set in for academic leaders, right? That if it was at all ambiguous before, what a learning moment to see how this is playing out in such obviously material ways for women and Black folk and Indigenous folk within the academy. And the other, perspective that I think about to make this come alive for academic leaders and faculty, and also the folk experiencing it who maybe are unwilling to acknowledge the inequity that they're experiencing, right? Like sometimes Folk living on the margins have learned to navigate by internalizing a sense of responsibility and inherent wrongness, right? The reason I'm struggling is there's something wrong with me because I'm inadequate, insufficient. So this type of training is for everyone, not just people with privilege. But it reminds me of McCluskey's concept of theory of margin, which is our margin is our power divided by our load. And our power being our resources to pursue our goals and our values, and our load being our responsibilities to ourselves and others and a number of factors of society. In this COVID moment, when we think about women and folk of color and queer and trans folk, has reduced their power and increased their load, right? It's not just the increased load of childcare, the increased stress of job loss within communities, but it's the relative powerlessness that has been exacerbated by COVID. And so I think it's an exponential impact. And those are two approaches that I would take in opening up conversations with faculty about how they want to be compassionate and caring and flexible and responsive in this moment. And so does it mean faculty not having to submit their evaluations of teaching for this year as a part of a tenure dossier? Does it mean giving them a tenure clock extension if they want to elect into it? Those are just some concrete things off the top of my head. But it's an awful moment, and one that I think could really illustrate some core concepts of diversity, equity, inclusion for people who have power and influence in the academy.
Well said.
An additional question, or the next question, but then there actually is another comment or something to reflect on, and I think it's very important. So now I'm gonna tap you and see if we can take advantage of your time for a few more minutes here to have this conversation. So another question from Divya was, how are OU and UNM making sure that the bias reporting, or these kinds of processes don't overburden BIPOC, female, and LGBTQ faculty and staff?
Oh, that is a great question. I think I'm uncomfortable answering it only in the reporting space, because actually I think when I ask any group of UNM faculty, where do they go if an issue arises? They all tell me they would go to the formal Office of Equal Opportunity and report. And I think that exposes what Jeff was saying is some of the lack of fit between what is, appropriate or going to be fruitful as a formal complaint under state or federal law, and the whole other areas of where the university wishes to hold us to a higher standard, where we hold each other to a higher standard. But I'm not sure I understand the question sufficiently, except to say that I think an appropriate expansion of supportive services will also make available and confidential those resources that BIPOC and other faculty wish to access because they are protected, and give them maximum flexibility and choice. And if we had world enough in time, this is where my complaint about the implementation of mandatory reporting under Title IX would come in. People trained as faculty to be mandatory reporters have become very fearful of saying anything about their own experience, lest it become the source of a report and generate an investigation and outcomes that they are not choosing. So I think that's particularly an area of vulnerability for less powerful members of our community who have good reason to want to control their stories. I think it's a great question, and I don't think UNM has done enough to answer that, precisely that.
Liz, I'm really glad you shared first and talked about this tension of mandatory reporting. And I'll start by reflecting in that space that you invoked Dr. Fry's work from University of Oregon, who's just down the road from us, that the limitations of mandatory reporting and the institutionalization of things like Title IX, to their many benefits, is the fact that we have generations of colleagues and students who have been betrayed by the institution, and so mistrust runs deep. And so the ability for those systems to work is undermined by long histories of betrayal. And when I hear this question about the adverse impacts of women and POC in these bias response processes, I think about those legacies of betrayal and how ultimately it extracts time, energy, labor, emotional vulnerability that ultimately results in no change. And so I just wanted to name that, and that's something that's real and a huge limitation in this compliance realm. And then a lot of the work that I do and my office does around bias incident response, it falls outside of compliance. And because of that, because it doesn't fall under the auspice of mandatory reporting, there's a lot more agency on part of the impacted party about the resolution that they would like to see. So we run the gambit from folk who say, this is what happened to me. I know the parties that are involved, and assuming their consent, I would like to engage in a comprehensive restorative justice process so that we all walk away feeling whole. On the complete other end, which is, I don't want this person to know. I just want to tell you, and I want you to write it on a piece of paper so that somewhere, some way, this data point has significance to the institution. And we follow the impacted party's lead about what's a good fit for them. And then there's everything in between. And what we are cautious of and what we try to advise on is not recommending a process that's going to put undue labor on people who've already been impacted, connecting them with the care resources they need to become whole again. But the opportunity of a place like Oregon State University is that we do have a demonstrable investment in diversity education. My FTE is an example of that, that all the time I work with men, white identified faculty and staff, heterosexual folks, cisgender folk, that their department chair gets to recommend a conversation with me. And it's like, if you would like a discrete place to process your internalized stuff, Jeff is a person that you can go work that through. And so in no way eliminates, but relieves a little bit of the pressure of well-meaning white folk, straight folk, all this wandering into the offices of women and people of color being like, can you help me figure out what it is I'm doing that's having such an adverse impact? They can be like, no, but you can't go talk to Jeff, right? And I think, but that's a bottom line investment of dollars on part of the institution to provide those resources so that they are not indirectly taxed upon groups of people who are already marginalized.
Well, and then I will raise this one last question, and this is a really hard one, and Tara did write it as a question, but also just for reflections. So we know over time, biased institutional decisions have multiplying consequences, and microaggressions and so on. I mean, people aren't getting tenure, they're getting bad reviews. They're leaving hostile work environments. Some are leaving academia. I mean, there's all these consequences to people's careers, to their lives, to their well-beings, to their health. But she said, are there examples where addressing some of the consequences of that for people's status, employment, or progress has some budget, or are most of the responses everyone has to go to a training?
I don't know, Jeff is the trainer, maybe you should go first.
Yeah, can you ask me that question in another way?
So can I just ask it? So so my experience with equity, diversity, and inclusion trainings is that you go, that I, as a compliance person, as a piece of compliance, I have to go stand in front of a computer and press some buttons and say that I'm not going to sexually harass anyone and that I know what sexual harassment is. Like, as a person, this is worse than ironic for me. So that's what I mean by training. in that question. But what I really mean is, I'm sure we all know people whose paths have diverged over time. And so is there ever any budget where you go, okay, well, we're going to, as an institution, look around at some of our equity and diversity practices. We're going to identify some of those path divergences, and we're going to say, okay, no, you should have this position now. Is there some budget in some? Can you think of some examples where there's some budget behind addressing some of that outcome for people?
Well, let me, and if I'm hearing this right, so the two things that stand out to me are compliance education and the type of education that myself and my office invests in, I think of as very, very different. I tend to think of the work that we do as leadership development, not unlike the way I think of our education as the type of ongoing development that is indicative of any kind of practice, right? That physicians continue to invest in their own education, teachers invest in their own education, artists invest in their own education. And so we invest in the practice of leading for equity. And by and large, the people, we don't do mandatory trainings because it undermines our outcomes when people are there in the context of requirement. And we have a whole other function of our institution who invests in don't sexually harass one another, don't engage in implicit biases in the search process, right? There's a whole other portfolio for those things. And then again, this is, if I'm hearing the question right, at what point are there teeth and consequences, like for our values, right? That who's wronging rights, or who's righting wrongs, and if there are people who are not responding to training, when are they getting removed from their jobs? If there are people who are working really hard and are not getting promoted, who's stepping in to correct that? And if I'm hearing that aspect right, or if this feels relevant for me to talk about it, I think that is an aspect of institutional courage that's missing at Oregon State and missing at most of our universities, right? That folk are willing to engage in education and training because it feels like the rubber doesn't have to meet the road, right? It's still, people can change if they want to, but we're not actually gonna put our foot down. And I think that's where the CYA stuff comes into play, is that people choosing to invest in education, to me, is not always an act of bravery. Sometimes it can be like a detour from realizing any kind of concrete change. But of course, I believe in education, I think it's a really important ingredient, but it's like having flour for the bread, but no yeast. So stuff's never gonna rise. You have to have flour, but without some consequence or some teeth, we're not gonna bake this bread.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I'm going to go bake some bread. Tara, I think also what I hear in your question is something that in the post colleague letter world, and even into the Betsy DeVos world, and at least in sexual harassment training, compliance in that whole field, we have a pretty high level of training fatigue. Which is important that Jeff pointed out that his own outreach is not mandatory, but rather responds to other incentives, right? People seeking support, departments that are troubled. We had the maximum experience of mandatory training. We trained 27,000 students in live settings for the Department of Justice against sexual assault. And we did a preliminary study of it, and it showed what we always see in mandatory trainings, which is unintended consequences of traditional gender norming and seeing women as victims, and all kinds of consequences that were not the intention of the training. in part because of the mandatory nature of it, right? It has a kind of regressive impact. And I think that's true also at the level of staff and faculty. How many times do you need to be told not to harass your colleague before you're frustrated with the system that's supposed to protect us all from that harassment? So I think this all comes back to questions of efficacy and research-based, victim-centered approaches to addressing harm and resolving conflict. That said, it's not easy, right? It's not simple or straightforward, but we already know that non-mandatory trainings that focus on implicit bias and bystander intervention are among the most effective. So maybe that's where we should be putting more of our resources, at the highest level of leadership. Something that helped on our campus that I think really helped us with a shift in the inclinations of all of our leadership to move beyond compliance was we held a joint conference in spring 2020 before the pandemic with the Department of the Navy. And it was a joint regional conference on sexual assault. And it was impressive how much more people were willing to listen to the refinements in best practices for both trainings and reporting mechanisms and institutional response when the Navy was in the room, as opposed to the Women's Studies Department. So I think questions of authority, right, and legitimacy in this domain are very important in moving certain sectors of our administrative leadership in the right direction. And that was something that worked for us as a state university.
And as we close this, Liz and Jeff, do you have any kind of closing thoughts or anything to leave us with that we may continue to discuss and think about?
I'm just trying to think about how to explain how you can fix racism in the next 30 seconds. So just give me another moment and I'll pull it together. I would imagine the conversations that you're about to endeavor into, your mind is going to take you in places that are easy to intimidate yourself, overwhelm yourself, spend a lot of times in the what ifs, the worst case scenarios, the gaps and the pitfalls. And I think that's okay. And I think you just need to acknowledge that that's natural for your mind to do that, and that that's a pattern of thought that doesn't necessarily lend to the bold leadership decisions we need to realize comprehensive institutional change. And so be realistic, but also be ambitious and optimistic. And again, I really appreciate that Liz kicked off our conversation today with a discussion of institutional betrayal, because Dr. Fry's assertion is that the solution to institutional betrayal is institutional courage. And so the path forward is going to be the result of courageous decisions. And as you think about what you want your leadership to be, ask yourself, what is the courageous thing to do?
I think what I would leave you with is the notion, born from my experience, that one of the reasons that compliance efforts have been very limited in their intended impact is that they are, by design, legalistic and cookie cutter. And that it's really critical for faculty and administrative leaders in different institutions to take stock of where your institution sits in its readiness for change, in anti-racism work, in anti-harassment work, and so forth. And actually, the readiness for change literature offers you kind of a self-diagnostic menu for assessing where your institution sits, where the communities within your institution sit in their readiness to even see what's not working before they devise appropriate solutions. So I think something I carry from my experience is that the degree to which we can engage with different constituencies and not cede all of the power for moving forward to either compliance or our equal, you know, our legal arm, the better we do, because we do actually have incredible assets in university communities of students, staff, and faculty who are permanently engaged in equity and diversity improvements. But we do have to protect those efforts, and we have to cherish the whistleblowers and protect them. So that these are all pieces of, I think, institutional courage, particularly if tenured faculty are willing to step up to the plate and take some responsibility and some risk.
Well, and with that, first to everyone, I say, don't go anywhere. We're continuing this workshop, but then I invite everyone to use your reactions or unmute yourself and join me in giving a very, very big thanks to Jeff and Liz for joining us today and having this conversation with us. So, and I say personally, a very deep thank you.
Well, thanks for inviting us. I hope you enjoy the rest of your experience together.
Ditto. I'm just going to follow Jeff around and say ditto wherever he goes.
Well, thank you both, and I hope you see all the thank yous in the chat. A very polite group who didn't want to unmute themselves and yell into the group, but we very much appreciate you spending this time with us. And so now we will turn it over to Betsy, who is going to lead the next part of our workshop. So Betsy.
Hey, everybody. I would like not to be on the spotlight if that's possible, because we're going to be doing some work together, and I'm going to share a couple of images quickly to get us started, and then I'll take it away. And I want us to sort of be all seeing each other as much as we can in the little Hollywood squares. So for anybody who knows me, I always have a Frida somewhere, right? Like I don't ever do anything without Frida. So here we have Frida Kahlo, and you can see she's a half deer, half person, and she's got a lot of arrows with blood coming out. And this is obviously kind of dramatic, but I want us to really think about how dramatic harassment and discrimination is, and how visceral it is, and how it really feels like something. There are most emotions, sensations, and feelings that are connected to experiencing harassment and discrimination. And so the next two parts of this, we really want to try to do some self-reflection, to thinking about the visceralness of this as our own experiences of harassment and discrimination, and our experiences of being the harm doers that produce discrimination and harassment in different situations. And I think, you know, there isn't a 100% yes or no that you have or have not done it, or that you have or have not experienced it. I think that's a pretty complicated space to sort of interrogate with ourselves and really do some self-reflection. So the first part before we take our break is to do a little body map storytelling. I'll just click through these. That was what we're going to do. Those are our folks. And this is body map storytelling. So we're going to do an activity where I'd ask everybody to get a piece of paper and a pen. If you have any other colors or any art supplies handy, we didn't ask people earlier to do this. But body map storytelling is something I've been doing a lot lately, and I feel like it's a really cool, important tool for planners. And the idea is that you're sort of thinking about your body, and you're able to draw and paint and collage with whatever you have answers to questions about your feelings, your experiences. And so it's a great self-reflection tool. And I just want to just show a couple of examples so you see how powerful it can be. This is like some woman in Colombia I did it with. This is a woman who's describing her experiences with domestic violence. And you can see she has one eye that is red. And she talked about how that is what happens when she gets her first punch in the eye. And then a few days later, you can see on the other side that it becomes purple. So she's able to really express what it feels like and what her experience is as she experiences violence, like visually. And this is a woman who was talking about, we asked people to describe, this is in Medellin, Colombia. This woman was from Choco, Afro-Colombian area in the north. And we asked about their experience of forced migration, removal, internal displacement. And she put this black X, this red X on her genital area. And she later, when she gave a description of what was happening, she said that in the context of this move, she stopped having her period and she was in her early 20s. And so these kinds of body maps can get at experiences that we don't necessarily display or understand or think about when we're talking and when we're having an interview or a focus group or something. So we have 5 questions we want to ask. And so I'm going to stop our pierced Frida body and ask everybody to think about, and I'll put all these questions one by one in the chat that we'll go through. But I want you to think about self-reflection, because I think that's a really important part of us as administrators. I just took on the role of the director of our graduate program in January, so I'm still drowning in emails and trying to get myself together here. But it's important for us to really be self-reflective, to be honest with ourselves about our past behavior, and be really intentional about understanding our histories, our family, our people, and how our bodies, what they represent, and how that translates into our relationships with people. And I just really loved the first part. Both Liz and Jeff really had some amazing things to say. And the idea of relationships came up multiple times, and that's really important. But we have to really think about who we are and how us, as everything that's represented in our bodies as we engage with people, what does that mean to other people? And then think about our past experiences of producing harm or receiving harm, and really get to that visceral feeling. What did that feel like? And once we sort of understand those feelings, my theory is, and I'm not pulling this out of my sleeve, but there's lots of data to suggest that once you understand something at that visceral level, you sort of change your behavior, right? You're going to be less likely to engage in harm-doing behavior if you have a better sense of what it does to people. And so that part of that is the self-reflection. And then we also want to go back to the issues of appropriation. And then finally, think about our strengths. Where do we have strengths on our body? Because it is our bodies that's going to do this. But where do we have that strength to make all that happen? So I'm going to stop sharing. And I'll put question number 1 in the chat. And if we can, I'll talk a little bit and sort of help, because this is something we don't necessarily do that often. Okay, I have a new mouse and it's giving me a hard time here. So I'm gonna sort of trying to do a little bit of coaching as we go along. So the first question is to, just went to not to everybody. Okay, did everybody get it twice now? Okay, draw the history of your people on your body. How is that history in or on your body? And when I say people, it can be whatever you like, whatever you think, it doesn't have to be your family, it can be your family. But if you have another group of people who you identify with, you can draw that too. But how do you feel like your body is linked to your people? How is that represented when you engage with people? How do other people see your body? What is on your body that links to your people? And it's good if we have gallery. I don't know if everybody has gallery. I just made a gallery. So think about your body. What are the different places and spaces? Maybe there's some things in your body that sort of get exposed sometime on the outside, even though they're on the inside. Is there a certain structure of your body, the color of your skin, the shape of different features? Is it your accent? Is it your eyes? Is it your mouth? Is it the way you think about things? What is it on your body that sort of links to your people, who you are? Shapes, symbols, patterns, different colors if you have different colors. Trying not to use as many words and doing more sort of visual drawing. Symbols are good. I like stickers. I have a lot of stickers when I do this in person, crepe paper and magazines to cut out. But we're doing low tech today. And when I see you looking up, that's a signal to me that there's, oops. People are moving. So some people still drawing. Wait another minute. Okay, I'm going to put the second question in. So draw the impact of your people on others around your body, and it could be close, or it could be on your body. How your people have had an impact on other people, or how other people have had an impact on you or your people. So this actually comes from Locating Yourself, the Novo Foundation, No Violence Foundation, and it's called Locating Yourself. And so these questions are not exactly their questions, but they sort of come out of the way that we're really trying to be self-reflective, but in a way that really looks not only at our individual, but sort of our history. We're looking at history. So have your people had a negative impact on another group of people? And what would that look like on your body? How did that happen? Or how did it happen around your body? And the same, how have other people had an impact on your people? So it can be both, or it can be one. But really thinking about that, what happened? What was the impact? How can you demonstrate visually that impact? Any shapes, symbols, colors? What would that look like? Patterns, shapes. Okay, so this next question is really long. We combined two questions, try to not have so many questions. So you can pick either one or both parts of it. Can you draw on your body how you felt when you realized that something you did or said caused harm to a colleague, and or how you felt when you observed someone saying something or doing something that caused harm to a colleague or harm to you? So thinking about the feelings when you observe something that's messed up, you see a colleague make an assumption about someone else based on their stereotyped identity, when you see someone getting hurt in a because of something somebody said or something did in your department, between colleagues, between students. I had a student come to my office and start crying and telling me about how in a class that she was asked to translate, be the translator, because the faculty member didn't realize the film they were showing was only in Spanish without subtitles. And so this Latina was asked to interpret for the whole class, and she said no. And the faculty member said, "Oh, that means you must not speak Spanish then." So for me, seeing her sitting in my office, it was very painful. Her tears, I felt her tears. I started crying, and I felt a big pain in my heart. I could feel some of the hair on my arms sort of go up. And it was very emotional to see the harm that was done to her in this class by the act of this professor. What does it feel like when you observe that, or if you realize you've done this? What do you feel? Do you feel remorse? Do you feel, not much? What do you feel? How does it feel? What are the impacts? Do your hands start getting sweaty? Do you feel your knees sort of shaking? Does your head start hurting? What are the visceral impacts of your observing or realizing that you have done some harm? What does it feel like? This is not easy. I see a lot of people quickly answering, which is not unusual. But this is not something we're necessarily going to finish today. Something I do and I think about, and hopefully you'll keep your maps and you'll have them to sort of inspire additional observations and thinking. Self-reflection here. That's the name of our game today. Okay, this is the next to the last question. Draw on your body what it feels like when you've realized you've appropriated or observed someone else appropriating some work, ideas, or anything. So I talked about this a little bit earlier, of a person of color. So if you were in a PhD program and a person of color had an idea and was working on it, but you grabbed the idea and finished first, and that other person had to start all over again. Or you're at a conference and you're talking with somebody about a paper idea you have, and then that person calls you 2 months later and says, "Oops, I just want to let you know that I just published this article, that we had that conversation, and you weren't in a tenure track position, so I didn't think you were going to do it anyways." And those are both real examples in planning, and there are many more. So when you see or hear about that, what does it make you feel? How does it make you feel? What are the emotions that it sets off? Is your head sort of buzzing? Really try to be in touch with the corporal experience of this. And it's important because I think we often disassociate these experiences. We don't engage with them on a level that makes them more real. When we can feel them, we can see, we can understand the sensations that it causes, not only for the recipient of the harm, but also for the observer of the harm and the harm doer, then it becomes a little bit more real. and it, at least in the literature, it causes different behavior. If it can be at arm's length and not be so real, then it's a lot easier to dismiss it and not deal with it, or not understand its importance. But when you can understand the real pain, the tension, all of the many visceral responses and experiences of harassment and discrimination, then it's a little harder to sort of brush it off. Makes it more important to deal with. Okay, last question. And this is, you know, I always like to end any body map storytelling with positive note and thinking about the power that we all have. And I'm asking you to draw in or on your body where you have the strength and the force to fight against discrimination and harassment in an effort to reduce harm in your departments. So is it your mouth? Do you have the power of your voice? Is it your ears? Are you a great listener and that helps you to mitigate and fight discrimination and harassment? Do you have strong feet that are you're gonna march to wherever you need to march to make a change? Are your shoulders a space of power for you where you can really engage in the struggle? Where is it that you have? Is it your heart? Hearts are always a big deal in any body map storytelling I've done. Hearts are really important. And do you have a big heart, a heart that's full of power to make changes? What are you thinking about? Where is your strength? Is it in your hands? Is it in the pen that you hold in your hand and you can write? Is it your back because you have a strong back and you can do some of the heavy lifting? Where are the places in your body where you have that strength to make change, to engage in this important struggle to eradicate discrimination and harassment? You can go back to any of the other questions if something's come to you and you want to add. If you're thinking about something, there's oftentimes something that has multiple meanings, can answer more than one question. You can sort of circle that or highlight it. You can write the questions down or copy them, so you'll have them as reference to sort of maybe later reflecting, and maybe adding more to your map as you do more thinking about this and doing more self-reflection. Take maybe one more minute, and then I'm going to ask anybody would like to share a little bit of their map. And what I usually do I usually don't do such big groups. I usually do about 5. I usually ask people to talk about the attributes of their maps and what they mean. What are the shapes, the symbols, and what do they mean for the mapper? And it can be really intense. So I'm asking, I don't want anybody to share something that would evoke undue stress. Often I will have a counselor in this because it can be, and I do a lot of work on violence against women in cities. And so we're often talking about violence and it can be emotional. And I've had people hyperventilate and I always need to have a little bit of care. So anybody who wants to share, I just want you to think about your self-care too and the ethics of care, which we heard a lot from Jeff, which I think was really important. Anybody want to share? Any brave souls? Courageous souls? And you don't even have to show the map if you don't want to.
I can, but I don't want to explain everything. I'll show, but I don't want to explain everything. Is that okay?
Yeah.
All right, let's see. There we go.
Uh-huh.
So there's a lot of stuff with zigzags. When I think harming others, it makes I feel like I shouldn't have done it. it's not right. That's a zigzag. That's a source of strength. I think my strength comes from my inner guts. The trauma is in the head in terms of my ancestors. That's the part I don't wish to discuss. The barrier is there's something in the throat where things are blocked when I see and witness something that shouldn't happen and I don't feel powerful. So that's kind of how I drew it. There's a lot of little zigzags and dots. But the strength for me comes from the inner belly.
And the belly is really powerful. Thank you so much. That was really amazing. And I feel like even though this is not something we've spent a lot, this takes a couple of hours to do, and there's some things I do before, and then there's some after stuff, but I really appreciate all of the details and thoughtfulness. That was much more than I expected in this short period. Anybody else want to share anything? Zigzags, is it your belly? And one of the things I see often is at the end when people sort of compare their maps and put their maps together, there's sort of a community of power. You know, somebody may have their power in their belly, somebody may have it on their shoulder, somebody may have it in their intellect, in their brain, somebody may have it in their eyes, but we sort of often end up with a complete whole set of strengths that together really enable people to move forward. And the community and the multiple different places that people find their strengths can work together to make change. Divya.
Share my screen because I drew it on a screen.
Yeah, you could. I think you can. Donna, can she?
I'm not an artist, so excuse my figurines. I think the first question was like, have you, how, you know, your ancestors, like how your people represented? And the most common question I get asked is things like daughter feathers. I'm often asked where I'm from, and that's an ambiguous question with a very ambiguous answer. When I experience or I see discrimination, often my heart races. I feel smaller when I experience it. My heart feels small. I feel diminished generally. And I feel when I see other people in the similar situation, I feel diminished. It's sort of an empathetic, I guess, response. I have been told very politely that I speak a lot for a woman, which is a terrible, terrible thing to be told. And it's basically saying, oh boy, like you speak a lot. And that's very pointedly, I have actually experienced that firsthand. The green bubble here just represents how my community, how my people, typically behave with other people, and it's with silence. A lot of South Asians are rather silent on racism against Black and Latino populations. So that is usually how we behave with silence. So it becomes complicit. And my power, I think, is the fact that I have tenure and that I am vocal. I've been brought up with decent amount of self-esteem and confidence. And I think I can think, and I use that, and that's my diagram.
Excellent. Anybody want to react to what you've seen so far in the body maps, or share more? Does this feel like?
I had an observation, if you don't mind. The fourth question about experienced it yourself or seen it happen to others. I found myself in really different places with those two scenarios, because when I experience it myself, that when I feel like I've been the perpetrator, the sense of guilt is living in a really different place in my body than the indignation that I feel when I see someone else as a perpetrator. So in some cases, it was interesting for me to hear Divya say that she experiences it herself, and then the same thing perpetrated on another person would also make you feel diminished. And I guess I just didn't interpret the question in the same way. I was thinking about when I've been a perp versus when I see it happen to someone else.
Right, and I would expect that. I would expect us to have very different interpretations of this based on our experiences. And what does guilt feel like? Where do you feel guilt? What does that feel like on your body? Is it like a pressure on your head? Like, the idea here is to really think about the visceralness of this, and then being in touch with that, to me, is the opportunity to not want to feel that, right? And if you don't want to feel that, then you have sort of things to do, which is the next part of our workshop, right? What do we do with that? But guilt is something that a lot of people deal with, but it's difficult to place it. Like, where is it exactly? Where does guilt feel? Where does it reside? On bodies, in bodies. So I think that's a really important observation. Anybody else? Any other comments, or anybody else want to share? How are we doing on time, Renia? When are we supposed to take our break?
We have probably another 15 minutes, and I know Chris was going to share, and then, so Chris, why don't you go ahead, and then I can share after that.
Okay, I don't know how well you can see this. Basically, what I got from my people, I come from a line of intellectuals, so the glasses and the soft hands are sort of the signs of intellectualism. Also, I mean, I did get a big nose, Roman nose, from the Italian side of my family, but in some ways the other features are more salient. Impact on other people. I have a palm tree and a gravestone, and somebody sort of walking away, looking unhappy. I'm a gentrifier. I live near the beach in LA, and I previously lived near Forest Hill Cemetery in Boston and Jamaica Plain. In both places, like it or not, I was a gentrifier and helped push other people out. It's interesting because I was sort of thinking about what Rolf said, and then Divya's comment. I feel like I do have similar reactions when I feel like I've hurt somebody, or when I see somebody being hurt. In both cases, I feel sort of anxious. So there's flushed cheeks, feeling a little choked, stomach hurting. I mean, there's a difference, but it's not. In some ways, there's a lot of similarities. And in terms of strengths, I feel like I've got the heart and the ears, but I don't like to offend people. I often have trouble making up my mind. There's a question mark floating there. So I'm not always so good on the follow through.
Yeah, I think that's awesome. And I don't know if this is related to it, but when Jeff was talking about the idea of advocating and empowerment, right? Like, how are we going to make the move to support and provide opportunities? And how are we going to maybe look more to the agency and sort of arrange resources that would be part of that agency? And I've seen that as sort of a really important distinction. And there are so many times when we don't want to offend people and we don't want to sort of get in there, but it is something to be negotiated and to engage in conversation with, right? I think my experience has been when people come to me and say, listen, what do you think about this? A recent example, and I was sharing this with Renia, was that there's this big, huge grant proposal, and they asked Ken, my chair, to be on it on equity, diversity, and inclusion. It's actually a science project on air pollution. And he said, well, maybe let me talk to Betsy and see if she wants to do it, because that's more of her area. But because he's this very well-known white male, he was tapped for it But then his advocacy for me was to say, I think Betsy would be better. But he came to me first and asked me if that's what I wanted in that situation. So I think there's a lot to be said for the dialogue that both Liz and Jeff were talking about, and balancing those, the advocacy, the protection, and the providing circumstances for agency. Anybody else? Rinya, you gonna share?
Well, I won't share my scrawl, but I will say something that was really like when Rolf said guilt, I started thinking in numerous times this sense of shame came up, and that was so clearly like having this like all over my skin, and the sense of like flushed cheeks and the embarrassment of it. But that was also being times I thought of that I experienced harm, or in the situation being embarrassing or not, and not being sure how to act. And that real sense of that uncertainty was something that I could feel all over in my skin, in being flushed, in being this real sense of tension descending, and that sticking with me. And I felt it actually most strongly in the question about knowing of someone's work getting appropriated, and that awareness of that, and just having that being like an overwhelming sense of like feeling it in every part of my body, and then a real sense of anger with it. But then what led to a sense of failure, and a colleague who also knew about the situation and who once said to me about, we failed in that situation to respond, and that real sense of like a deep sadness and guilt, but also like the feeling of like a deep shame with that. But I was really struck by that. I felt shame both being when I was subject to harm and sort of internalize that, and shame observing harm, and shame when I was causing harm, and really felt like that was pushing me to act. But like Chris, I feel like my heart, I first marked, like my heart is where I act, and I think, no, my heart is there, but it's my mouth, it's my hands, right? It's it's a very feeling very aware that oftentimes I stay silent. Sometimes I talk a lot, as my friends and colleagues, and other times I say nothing, and that silence that I see. So it was very much the power being in the action, in the hands and mouth and speaking.
And could you say a little bit more about the shame? Like what does shame feel like? Where do you feel the shame in your body?
I feel it very strongly in like flushed cheeks and like my neck and all that, but very much in my skin, like this sense of when something happens, that it just becomes almost like a prickling all over, and this heightened attention to the situation. And it's, with that sort of acute vision sometimes we get when something feels very intense, but with a prickling all over skin, but arms, neck, face, very strongly.
Yeah, that's very precise, and I think it demonstrates a little bit of what we're sort of taught to ignore in the academy. It's all about the facts and the data and the analysis, but we often are moved away from really being in touch with how it all feels on our bodies and in our bodies. And I feel like that's part of the failing of the academy, that the ability to separate and not pay attention to those experiences, like the real visceralness of all of this stuff, which I think so far pretty much everybody sort of demonstrated that it is very physical to bodies, that if we can get closer to that, if we can see that, and I know I'm sounding like a broken record, but it helps us to move to action. It helps us to really think about, this is real, this is painful, this hurts, this feels this way or it feels that way. It's impacting our bodies. We know that it impacts our health. women of color in the academy have a much higher rate of cancers of all kinds. All of this causes stress in different places in our bodies. So it is a matter of life and death, and it is an important part of how folks are either continue and get tenure like Divya or not, or get pushed out. And we know so many faculty of color in planning have been removed at the 3rd year or removed at tenure, and some came back, some have gotten tenure, some have not. But all of this visceralness, all of the way that this is impacting bodies, if we can really have a visual of that through body mapping, through our discussions, and through really centering our sensations, emotions, and feelings, both as receivers and doers, but also seeing that we feeling our power to make change, that can be a really important point forward for us. And we are moving in that direction in a little bit here. Does anybody want to have anybody have any last minute reflections or thoughts about the idea of either body mapping or are really focusing on our experiences in this kind of a way? Does it feel different now that you've gone through this? Like, do you see or do you think about harassment and discrimination at all differently? Or does it add anything to the way you're thinking about moving forward? I see a hand here, Gwen.
On my drawing, I had really long arms. So you can maybe see.
We can't with your screen.
Oh, okay.
You can just describe it for us.
So I had really long arms because I think one of the critical things, both to being supportive of people who are being harassed by others, and also getting healing from your own harassment, is to link up with other people. So you should not go it alone. And if you see somebody in that situation, one of the first ways that you can help is by letting them know that they're not alone.
Yeah, and arms, having big arms. And we can't actually do hugs. Some people don't like hugs, but we can do virtual hugs. Lakshmi.
Thank you, Betsy. I think this experience, it was really useful for me to do, but I also have to say it just brought up so many feelings of internal anger, like, you know, and then in my drawing, I made in our culture, we don't bury people, we cremate them, but I drew a coffin and I put a body in there and I wrote, bury that person. And so there's so much anger that I buried, and this workshop brought it up.
Yeah, that often happens. I mean, there is so much anger. I had a lot of anger too. And I haven't actually done, I haven't done it with these questions for myself. I didn't test them out before I usually do a lot of other kinds of community engaged work with this, not specifically. And I did one library, a librarian group to think about their work with library users, but sort of in this kind of professional approach. And I feel like I need to do it to sort of really pinpoint the anger for myself. And in some cases, guilt, in some cases, shame. And I mean, a lot of the emotions and sensations that people have shared, I feel them too. And by not recognize them, we're not dealing with them, right? And because it becomes more real, then like that's sort of a jumping off spot for us. Not to discard the anger, but to recognize it and figure out, do we need to deal with it in some other way? What can we do? What can we do? Any other comments or questions?
And Samina and Tara both put in the chat about possibly sharing, so I want to if either one of you would like to do that.
Yeah.
I'm happy to pass to Tara.
Thanks, Samina. Mine is a little bit just about what I've been thinking about. So I'm going to see if you guys can you see this little drawing? There we go. So I was thinking about my people, and I'm thinking about, like, I've just kind of moved to the north, and so my people, and that is supposed to represent the kind of history of oppression and the relationship to the landscape of my people and the First Nations people. And so to me, I don't have, like, my feet are connected to the land because, that's kind of my people, and so are the First Nations people. And it's just something that I'm really challenged by in my work. And to me, body is, it goes into the ground. So it's an interesting, I like drawing that picture. So.
Yeah, that's what I like about this, that it can be so many things. I say draw a body, but you can do anything, and it really speaks to where you are and what's coming out. And it's good to pay attention to that and let it happen.
Then maybe I'll say,
Amina?
I did not do the body map. I'm sorry. I found it too difficult and just too difficult. But I was moved by Divya. And so I'm going to say that my observation is that there's 44 leaders from around the United States and almost no, if any, Black presenting colleagues on the call. And that's what's sitting with me.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I noticed that at the board meeting too. I mentioned it to Lakshmi. And I don't know how many other Native folks here, but there's not a lot of us either represented. Renia, did you have some thoughts as some concluding remarks maybe?
Not so much concluding remarks, but next steps. So we're going to go into a break, and let's say 10 minutes, the Zoom will just be left open. And when we were going to return, we will go into breakouts. And the idea of the breakouts is really to focus on thinking of a few actionable steps that we can take in our departments, but also identifying, are there resources we need to do that? We know that with ACSP, financial resources are slim, but like other things that also ACSP may do in this. And then in that, it'll just time-wise now, it'll be, short 15. Let's see, if we come back at 4:20, it'll be about 15 minutes to really think of a few concrete steps, come back as a group. We will ask that you put those that the actionable items put in the chat, and we will be compiling those and making them available, trying to add additional resources and disseminate that to everyone. So I really encourage, so let's say come back at 4:20, and then we will go into breakouts. And if you come back a few minutes later, still come back, and Donna will be here, and and then you can enter the breakout when you come back, at what point you come back. And Marlon just said, thank you, Betsy. And I think we all probably, would really like to thank you, Betsy, for this.
My pleasure.